Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend burned the world down. But it didn't exactly set the literary world on fire. How could it? Published as a Fawcett gold medal paperback, cover price 25 cents, the book was considered pulp fiction, albeit in the minds of some critics, very fine pulp indeed. Among those who deigned to review I Am Legend, Matheson was marked as a writer to watch, and the book itself was stamped as the best vampire novel since Bram Stoker's Dracula. Nevertheless, Matheson was not quite ready to quit his day job, actually his night job, cutting out templates at the Douglas Aircraft Company's Santa Monica branch. In fact, he would briefly quit his adopted West Coast to return east with his family, settling temporarily on Long Island, where he wrote his next novel, The Shrinking Man. When Universal Pictures sought to acquire that novel, Matheson stipulated that he would sell it only if he could be hired to write the screenplay. Universal played ball, and the success of The Incredible Shrinking Man, released in May of 1957, allowed Matheson to return in something like triumph to his adopted Los Angeles, where he kept company with a cadre of science fiction, fantasy, and horror writers, among them Rod Serling, Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, Charles Beaumont, William F. Nolan, guys who called themselves the Southern California Sorcerers. There was interest as well in a feature film adaptation of I Am Legend. That interest, however, came not from Hollywood, but from England. Producer Anthony Hines of Hammer Film Productions had just scored an international hit with Curse of Frankenstein, a lurid Technicolor reboot of the Mary Shelley novel starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee as Monster Maker and Monster, respectively. Hammer wanted a follow-up, and they saw the potential of I Am Legend. This is Richard Harland Smith, and I bid you welcome to this audio commentary for The Last Man on Earth, the first feature film adapted from I Am Legend, and what we wound up with when things didn't work out for Hammer. Hammer flew Matheson to London, and he set to work banging out a screenplay titled by Hammer as The Night Creatures, to be directed by Val Guest. Matheson both simplified and opened up the narrative of I Am Legend, expanding upon plot sidebars of the novel, ramping up the brutality, and generally giving the screenplay the blood and thunder that Hammer seemed to be going for with Curse of Frankenstein. Hammer was pleased with the results, but the British censors felt there was too much blood and thunder, and threatened, should Hammer proceed with The Night Creatures as written, not to pass it for theatrical release. Hammer relented, and that was that. The company proceeded instead with a like-minded follow-up to Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, released in the U.S. as The Horror of Dracula, and another team-up of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, this time out as Vampire and Vampire Hunter, respectively. That 1958 release, while not stinting on the Kensington gore, was passed by the British Board of Film Censors and went on to become another international hit. A few years later, Hammer repurposed the title Night Creatures for the U.S. release of Captain Clegg, a film based on characters created by Russell Thorndike for his 1950 novel Dr. Sin, A Smuggler's Tale of the Romney Marsh, and its sequels. The same material adapted by the Walt Disney Corporation as Dr. Sin, alias the Scarecrow, or the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, as it was known stateside. Matheson, his work done, and not all that well compensated for it, returned to Los Angeles to get on with his life. It would be the first in a battery of disappointments attending the book for which he is, nearly 70 years later, best remembered and beloved. Another individual to see the movie that I Am Legend could be was American writer Harry Spalding, later the screenwriter of such films as Curse of the Fly, Witchcraft, and House of the Damned. At the time, Spalding was an employee of film producer and cinema owner Robert L. Lippert, who had a side hustle in making B-movies for A-list Hollywood studio 20th Century Fox. Lippert liked the novel, specifically the cost-effective small cast and limited locations, and acquired the rights from Tony Hines at Hammer, who was all too eager to sell the seemingly unfilmable property. It's hard to know with a character such as Robert Lippert where the line between reality and ballyhoo was drawn. In early meetings with Matheson, Lippert claimed he was going to get Fritz Lang to direct his adaptation of I Am Legend, which he intended to title Naked Terror. Lippert also claimed to the press that he was 90% ready to sign opera diva Maria Callas to sing the film's theme song. But even the press remained skeptical, as Callas was devoting her time in those days to Greek tycoon Aristotle Onassis. When Lippert had to come clean to Matheson that he hadn't signed Fritz Lang, but rather hired American efficiency director Sidney Salkow, Matheson carped famously, "Well, that's a bit of a drop." Lippert also hired TV writer William F. Lester to do another pass on the material, making changes that alienated Matheson. Not wanting his name attached to what he considered to be a travesty of his novel, Matheson opted for the pseudonymous co-scripting credit of Logan Swanson, a portmanteau of his wife's and mother's maiden names. Looking to maximize his shooting budget of $300,000, Lippert elected to have The Last Man on Earth, as the production came to be called at long last, shot in Italy with local talent Ubaldo Ragona, a former film journalist turned documentary filmmaker, hired to marshal the all-Italian crew and cast of supporting players. Sidney Salkow's responsibility would be to oversee the film's American release via American International Pictures. Having script on the pre-production, and to a certain extent the location, Lippert put his money where it would make the most difference, in star Vincent Price, somewhat newly minted in those days as a horror superstar thanks to such films as William Castle's The House on Haunted Hill, Kurt Newman's The Fly, and Roger Corman's House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum, both scripted, it's worth noting, by Richard Matheson. Price traveled to Rome in late January 1963 ahead of a February start date for principal photography on The Last Man on Earth. That's the potted history of how this movie came to be made. We'll delve into specifics in good time. Now, I said earlier that Price was a relatively new horror icon at this point. Now, if that raises an eyebrow, what about The Invisible Man Returns, you might well ask? What about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein? What about House of Wax? Yes, he appeared in those movies, but in the main, he was a working character actor, and for every psychotronic title that appears on his resume, he appeared in dozens of dramas, comedies, romances, adventures, westerns, musical, films noir. Sure, you've seen The Abominable Dr. Phibes and Tomb of Ligeia and The Tingler, but have you watched him in Curtain Call at Cactus Creek, The Three Musketeers, Leave Her to Heaven, The Las Vegas Story? Even post House of Wax, in which he plays, for all intents and purposes, a monster, he didn't appear in another true horror movie until House on Haunted Hill 6 years later. In The Fly, made a year prior to that, he's an onlooker, a bystander, a human witness. Price had already made two other pictures in Italy, costumers both. Fernando Cerchio's Queen of the Nile opposite Jean Crane and Edmund Purdon, and Mario Costa's Rage of the Buccaneers in support of lead Ricardo Montalban. Villains in both, Price was wardrobed extravagantly and encouraged to revel in Machiavellian excess, as you know he did. For The Last Man on Earth, things would be very different indeed. Price would be playing more or less a regular guy, a suburban husband and father, a suit and tie guy, yes, a scientist, but not a mad one. Instead of playing a flamboyant dandy living in opulence and splendor, he plays a man all but broken by grief and living in a depressing atmosphere cobbled together half by necessity, half by ruin. I can't think of many other Vincent Price movies in which you are allowed to see his undershirt. Richard Matheson had worked well with Price on House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum, but he felt he was miscast in The Last Man on Earth, understandably. Matheson's protagonist, Robert Neville, here called, for some occult reason, Robert Morgan, was 36 at the top of I Am Legend. As conceived by Matheson, Neville is slightly built with lank blonde hair, and he's not a scientist, but rather a war veteran. What war is never specified, but given that the book spans the years 1976 to 1979, we'd have to speculate it occurred at some point in the early 60s, and during which time presumably bigger atomic or nuclear bombs were dropped, which rates a passing reference in the novel. We don't know exactly what type of personality Robert Neville was before he became the last man on Earth, and post-apocalypse we see that he is, however resourceful, impulsive, self-pitying, self-destructive, quick to anger, and prone to excess, most often manifested in binge drinking. In short, a man's man, the very sort of protagonist Matheson used to craft for the pulp magazines to which he contributed stories before he became an in-demand Hollywood screenwriter. These characteristics had never been Vincent Price's stock in trade. Price was known for playing urbane, erudite men of high breeding, whose morality was on a sliding scale from elevated to dastardly. Add to that, Price was nowhere near 36. When he arrived in Rome to begin shooting this film, he was 51. As a point of comparison, when Charlton Heston starred in The Omega Man, the 1971 Warner Brothers reboot of I Am Legend, he was 47. Still up there, but we might knock off a couple of years for fitness. When Will Smith played Robert Neville in 2007 in I Am Legend, he was 37 or 38, which makes Smith the actor closest in age to how Matheson conceived his protagonist. And that makes Price the oldest. There's something slightly arthritic about Price in this, though playing antiquity was becoming more and more his thing. Yet, just a couple of years earlier in Rage of the Buccaneers, he acquitted himself fairly well as a swashbuckler, albeit one who let his minions do the scut work.
I'm out of gas. That means one more stop I'll have to make.
A frequent complaint about Last Man on Earth is that the setting is too obviously not the Los Angeles of the novel. And yes, there's the dome of the Basilica di Santi Pietro de Paolo in the distance.
I can get rid of them later.
Price and Sidney Salkow both harped on the challenge they faced in making Rome look like L.A. in interviews given in the years after they made the film. And while I agree that I would never mistake one, in which I have visited, for the other, in which I lived for many years, this never bothered me or detracted from my enjoyment of the film. For one thing, The Last Man on Earth never specifies what city we're in. We are in America, as we can see from the presence of U.S. military, but beyond that, it's left vague. Sidney Salkow's son Steve was, at the time of filming, a student at the Overseas School of Rome, a private non-denominational academy in northwest Rome, and being fluent in Italian, helped scout locations for the film. The majority were grabbed in an area of Rome called the EUR, the Esposizione Universale Roma. The area was conceived as a prospective site of the 1942 World's Fair, although due to developments of the Second World War, that exhibition never came to pass. We'll see some of the landmarks of the EUR shortly and talk about their significance, but first a visit to the gates of hell. Steve Salkow told me that there was strip mining being done at one time outside of Rome on the Appian Way, and that's where the pit scenes were filmed. The burning pit in which the bodies of plague victims, and later the vampires that Robert Neville has dispatched, such an indelible plot point of I Am Legend, appears only in this film version of the novel, and I think the filmmakers do a credible job in bringing it to life, if life is even the appropriate word here, given their obvious lack of wherewithal in making this film. I love how Price keeps one hand in his pocket while lighting up the corpse pile. That man had style to burn. The two biggest stylistic influences on The Last Man on Earth were the 20th anniversary of fascism, which would have been 1942, for which most of the buildings of the EUR were built, and the 1960s Summer Olympics, which were held that year in Rome and for which significant modernization of the city was undertaken. Though the EUR was morphing into the business district it is today, it was intended by Benito Mussolini as a tribute to fascism. The buildings there are large, cold, imposing, one might even say cruel, just like in America. The first Italian-American style supermarket was opened in Rome in 1957 under the aegis of the U.S.-based International Basic Economy Corporation, the IBEC. Key to the development of these markets were expansive parking lots, big enough for hundreds of cars, even though there were never enough vehicles to fill those spaces in Rome. That was someone being forward-looking. It may well be that this particular supermarket was constructed with the expected patronage of the international audience of the Olympics teams and their followers, the press, the dignitaries, the celebrities. Incidental music for The Last Man on Earth is, incidentally, courtesy of the team of Paul Sawtelle and Burt Schefter, who provided atmospheric cues to such films as The Return of the Fly. Sawtelle had scored The Fly on his own, Kronos, and It, The Terror from Beyond Space, as well as a couple of features each for Irwin Allen and Russ Meyer. Now, that's range. Their individual resumes are even more impressive. Paul Sawtelle wrote music for some of my favorite film noir titles, The Threat, The Devil Thumbs a Ride, T-Men, Inferno, and Kansas City Confidential, as well as Edgar Ulmer's Goofy, Daughter of Dr. Jekyll. Burt Schefter was better known as a concert pianist and orchestra conductor. At various times he led the New York Philharmonic, the London Philharmonia, and the Hollywood Bowl Symphony, and his TV cues were heard on dozens of popular television series in the 60s, among them 77 Sunset Strip, Maverick, Hawaiian Eye, and Cheyenne. Additionally, Schefter's music pops up uncredited in a lot of low-budget drive-in fare in such films as Teenage Zombies, The Slime People, and Nightmare in Wax. At a few points in The Last Man on Earth, we get glimpses of the viaduct of the Corso Francia, an overhead superhighway designed by engineer Pier Luigi Nervi to speed motorists across Rome, another jewel in the crown of the 1960 Olympics. Now here we're clearly in studio, the studio in question being Titanus Studios, a heavily trafficked studio of that time, then owned by Goffredo Lombardo, the son of founder Gustavo Lombardo. Many of the bright lights of post-war Italian filmmaking paid their dues at Titanus, among them Federico Fellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, and Lina Wertmuller, although in this calendar year of 1963, the studio was gutted financially due to the box office failure of Robert Aldrich's Sodom and Gomorrah and the expense of Luchino Visconti's The Leopard, and was forced to shutter, eventually rebranding itself as a film distributor. I always found these creatures that Robert Morgan is hunting down to be as sublimely creepy as they are ultimately pathetic. Robert Morgan is no Abraham Van Helsing, certainly as personified by Peter Cushing in Horror of Dracula and its first sequel, Brides of Dracula. Cushing's Van Helsing is almost a romantic hero, leaping gymnastically over tables and railings to rain destruction upon the undead, most of whom are up on 2 feet, more than ready to take him on. Price is like a process server, catching these pitiable creatures unawares at their most vulnerable. Here we get a good glimpse at the Palazzo dello Sport in the EUR, where basketball tournaments for the 1960 Olympics were played. And the Ferris wheel was part of the Luna Park Permanente di Roma, a popular amusement park and filming location. Dino Risi filmed scenes for his omnibus comedy I Mostri there the same year as The Last Man on Earth. One wonders about the film The Night Creatures might have been had Hammer Film Productions not run afoul of the British censor. Specifically, who would have been the star? Peter Cushing? Possibly. I can see him handling a lot of these chores with his trademark aplomb. Although set by fiat of Hammer in Canada, The Night Creatures features Matheson's everyman take on Robert Neville, and I think Cushing would have brought great pathos to the part. But in those days, Hammer might also have fallen back on the reliability of an American name, as they had in the past, importing the likes of Robert Preston, Dane Clark, Howard Duff, Brian Donlevy, none of whom strike me as ideal casting in this setting, though. Matheson thought Jack Palance would have been good casting. Palance would, in fact, act for Hammer in Robert Aldrich's post-war drama 10 Seconds to Hell, released in 1959, well after the Night Creatures deal was off the table. At some point down the line, decades after the fact of this film and The Omega Man, but prior to the Will Smith version, some journalist asked Richard Matheson what his favorite cinematic version of I Am Legend had been, and Matheson was unequivocal in his response. He said, Night of the Living Dead. That's right, George Romero's classic 1968 flesh-eating ghoul shocker, Night of the Living Dead, the patient zero of all zombie pictures to come. And Romero was nothing if not reciprocal in his praise for I Am Legend, stating that had the book never been published, there never would have been a Night or Dawn or a Day of the Dead, and by extension, no Return of the Living Dead, no 28 Days or 28 Weeks Later, no Resident Evil, no Walking Dead, none of the seemingly limitless homages and rip-offs of the Romero film that have invaded our personal space over the course of the last half-century. Romero was not so forthcoming with his praise for The Last Man on Earth. To the best of my knowledge, he never acknowledged it as an influence on Night of the Living Dead, but there sure is a likeness, isn't there? It's very easy to forget that the shambling, dead-eyed, barely sentient things that hag Robert Morgan's existence night after night are vampires. They look to modernize like zombies, like Romero's ghouls or flesh-eaters, and the high-contrast black-and-white cinematography of Franco Dellicoli certainly seals that resemblance, as do the hastily shuttered windows of Robert Morgan's Castle Keep. Some writers have been so bold as to say in no uncertain terms that George Romero ripped off The Last Man on Earth, but I'm willing to give Romero the benefit of the doubt. I really don't know. I do know that The Last Man on Earth did play various bijous and drive-ins in Romero's hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on both a double bill with Sergio Corbucci's Goliath and the Vampires, and on triple bills with Goliath and Hiroshiro Honda's King Kong vs. Godzilla, meaning it's entirely possible that someone on the future Night of the Living Dead team saw The Last Man on Earth and elements of that movie's aesthetic leached into Night of the Living Dead. But that's as far as I'll go. Revisiting The Last Man on Earth is a significantly different viewing experience post-COVID-19, after more than a year, for many folks, of enforced solitude. of shelter in place, of supply hoarding and curfews and fervid discussions of disease and communicability, and chancy trips into the outside world for essentials. The flashback scenes coming up are often cited as one of the weak points of The Last Man on Earth, but to my eyes, they are the most compelling now because they remind me of all the talk that went on in the first few frightening weeks of the national lockdown. Hell, the international lockdown. The wild speculation, the crazy, often cruel accusations, the panic, and the mental and physical exhaustion we all felt. In his novel, Richard Matheson often foregrounds Robert Neville's sexual frustration, to which the female vampires crowding his house by night were sensitive enough so that they would hike up their skirts like waterfront prostitutes to vex and, yes, even excite him, obviously a cinematic no-no even a decade later. Instead, we get Robert Morgan's weariness, his lassitude, his essential emptiness, which is often offered in counterpoint to the enervated body habitus of the vampires calling him out. By 1971, our protagonist's celibacy, his impotence, was a non-starter. Cinematic standards and practices had relaxed enough to allow Charlton Heston, who did an excellent job, I think, in selling Robert Neville's gnawing horniness, to get it on with the last woman on Earth. But I think in retrospect, Robert Morgan's sexless grieving is the more relatable in these pandemic times. I'm tempted to think that this cemetery location is the American World War II cemetery in the Lazio region of Rome. The presence of so many unadorned crosses speaks to me of wartime casualties sustained during the liberation of Sicily in 1943 and on the Anzio beachhead in 1944. That cemetery was dedicated in 1956 and converted from a temporary burial place to a lasting memorial that could explain the presence of construction in these shots as the cemetery took its final shape. I also think that it would have been more acceptable to Roman authorities for the Last Man on Earth crew to set up in a burial ground not full of the deceased loved ones of Catholic Italian families. Anyway, that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. This is straight out of Matheson. Silence held him in its cold and gentle hands. If I could die now, he thought, peacefully, gently, without a tremor or a crying out, if I could be with her, if I could believe I would be with her. His fingers tightened slowly, and his head sank forward on his chest. Virginia, take me where you are. End quote. This is, I think, the quintessential Mathesonian scene, present in some form in the novel and all film versions, the bit where Morgan Neville gets caught out after dark and has to make it home through the undead mutant throng.
The sun's already set. They'll be everywhere.
There's something so creepy about those vampires peeking through the fence. They're almost like horrible little kids. The Omega Man shifted this scene to the first act, which added immediacy to the plot. I confess I'm a big fan of the Omega Man, so if you expect me to talk smack about it, you're in for a rough night. Seeing the Omega Man at an impressionable age led me to read the source novel, and here I am some 45 years later recording an audio commentary for The Last Man on Earth. I just love the Italian extras playing the living dead. They look a bit too like the resurrected dead in that old John Agar movie, Invisible Invaders, which some wit dubbed, aptly, Night of the Living Dads. I haven't yet identified Italian actor Giacomo Rossi Stewart playing, we'll find out shortly here, Robert Morgan's old friend and next-door neighbor, Ben Cortman, Barney Rubble to his Fred Flintstone. In psychotronic circles, Rossi Stewart is probably most famous for playing the hero of Mario Bava's gothic masterpiece, Operazione Paura, or Kill Baby Kill as it was known in the United States. He was a handsome guy, but there was always something slightly melancholic about him, which makes him a perfect fit to play Ben Cortman, Robert Morgan's former friend and chief antagonist. This is a proto Night of the Living Dead moment here, slamming the door on a zombie arm, or vampire arm. George Romero would take this idea and run with it, having one of the protagonists of Night of the Living Dead hack at the zombie hand with a knife and look on with disgust as the fingers fall away like tallow. A throwaway line in Matheson's original novel, in which Neville considers his options one evening and debates whether or not he should set up the projector and watch a movie, he doesn't, becomes a poignant set piece here. This scene is exclusive to the rewrite of Richard Matheson's The Night Creature script, which means it's the work of William F. Lester. Lester almost gets treated like a bad guy in the Richard Matheson hagiography, the scab who had the temerity to rewrite Matheson's script, and who, the received wisdom goes, made such a botched job of it that Matheson took a synonymous credit. But I think Lester, who was primarily a TV writer with credits on Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, did creditable work on The Last Man on Earth and had an influence that lived on. For one thing, he made the protagonist a scientist, not a factory worker who becomes an amateur scientist. That economic switcheroo allowed Robert Lippert et al. To jettison most of the novel's middle section, in which Neville teaches himself bacteriology and scientific protocols. Fascinating on the page, but probably not so much on the screen. And of course, every legitimate film version of the novel that followed kept the main character as a scientist. And this scene of Morgan watching old home movies has an analog in both The Omega Man and I Am Legend. Instead of home movies, Charlton Heston sits in an empty theater and watches the rock documentary Woodstock, and Will Smith quotes dialogue while looking on at the DVD playback of Shrek. Price is excellent here. He really could navigate that fine line between laughter and absolute gutting grief. It's almost like an acting exercise, the kind of manipulative stuff they get you to do in acting class. The Last Man on Earth takes place 3 years after the world ended. Matheson's source novel began 5 months in January 1976, meaning the situation, for want of a better word, reached a head in July of 1975. And then the story jumps ahead to 1978 before ending in 1979. That span gives Neville in the book a good time to grow, to learn, to adapt. Robert Morgan never gets that growth, and this is no doubt one of the reasons why Matheson disliked this interpretation so much. He saw Robert Neville as a modern-day Robinson Crusoe, and even name-checked that novel in his text. More on that later. The actress playing Virginia Morgan is Emma Danieli, real name Emma Fretta. Her film career lasted about 20 years, but she was not prolific. She made her film debut a decade earlier in the Italian anthology We the Women, directed by Luchino Visconti, Roberto Rossellini, Luigi Zampa, Alfredo Guarini, and Gianni Francolini, and starring Ingrid Bergman, Alida Valli, Anna Magnani, and Issa Miranda, all playing themselves. Danieli also played herself and appeared in the film's prologue. It's an interesting choice to have Morgan behind the camera, filming a scene and a life that he will not be included in when the film is developed. Everything captured by his camera will die. I may be making too much of this moment, but as a scientist it seems as if he has preserved with this home movie a specimen of life that he can study rather than live in. And then life, as it is wont to do, curses him with what he wanted.
Open them and see. Open them and see.
Come.
Take a look at this.
Here it's a European disease. In Matheson's screenplay for Hammer, it was an Asian plague, which cuts a bit too close to the bone now, COVID-wise, doesn't it?
It's highly theoretical, Ben.
Theoretical? Do I have to remind you that theory is the beginning of solution?
The friendship of Robert Morgan and Ben Cortman is, as conceived by Matheson, sort of rudimentary. Cortman is a co-worker and a buddy, a next-door neighbor, but the character doesn't have a lot of resonance beyond the gimmick of having the protagonist's best friend become his worst enemy. I like what they've done with Ben Cortman here, making him a sort of anxious yin to Morgan's skeptical yang.
I I cannot accept half-baked theories that sell newspapers. I'm a scientist, not an alarmist.
You're whistling past the graveyard.
Is that a commentary on my work at the lab?
We both know how hard you've worked.
I'm sorry, Ben. I just can't accept the idea of universal disease.
What a line for our times.
All right, Kathy. Who can resist that face?
Virginia, too, is fleshed out a bit more in the Lester draft, or rather she's given better questions. Neville and his wife do have a brief conversation, something like this in the novel, and in Matheson's adaptation, it's a three-hander with Cortman. And keep in mind, via Matheson, all three are civilians. They're all on the outside, trying to look in. I prefer this take on the scene as it makes Morgan and Cortman part of the solution and demonstrates Morgan's, I'm not sure what the word is, selfishness, insularity, the clinical aloofness of Robert Morgan, who doesn't really level with his wife. He doesn't treat her as an equal. He tries to placate her. I suppose he thinks he's being protective, doing that mid-century thing of being the man. But look what good it does him in the end.
Right now our problem is to cut that cake.
Hey, Mommy! Hey, Mommy!
Coming.
In the novel, Richard Matheson more or less debunks the vampirism of Gothic and romantic fiction to identify a germ that affects the blood of human beings and gives them the characteristics of the bloodsuckers of folklore. Matheson further speculates, and it feels right, that the germ is carried on the winds and dust storms that are part of both the book and Matheson's screenplay. But curiously, although Matheson includes a lot of the detail about the germ, he doesn't carry forward the dust storm angle, though he leaves in the visual of the mosquito netting that we see here in Kathy's room. Lester scuttles most of that scientific talk, oddly, while making Neville Morgan a scientist, but there's the netting still, a holdover from a forgotten plot point. A bit more about Emma Danieli, a delicately pretty actress who, like co-star Giacomo Rossi Stewart, didn't have the expected dark Italian look. She was from northern Italy, the Lombardy region, often played aristocratic ladies in a scattering of swashbucklers and costume dramas, enjoyable continental fare, but not particularly noteworthy from an artistic standpoint. Ciro Marcellini's The Devil's Cavaliers, playing the good girl to Maria Gianna Canali's bad, and Domenico Palolello's Guns of the Black Witch, opposite burly American star Don McGowan, who played the post-op creature in The Creature Walks Among Us. As here, a lot of her screen time is taken up by concerned looking on. It must have been nice for her here not to have to squeeze into a corset, at least.
I'm all right.
Oh, don't get up, honey.
As the vogue for swashbucklers waned in the mid-1960s and the one for spy films got rolling with the success of Eon Productions' James Bond films, Danieli, like a good working Italian thespian, went where the money was and acted in some of those post-Last Man on Earth. Mario Caino's globe-trotting spy strikes silently, once again playing the blonde heroine to Erica Blank's raven-haired villainess, and Umberto Lenzi's The Spy Who Loved Flowers, one of 3 Euro-spy films made by Lenzi starring Roger Brown as 007 knockoff Super 7. The child actress playing Kathy Morgan is Christy Cortland. With these films, Danieli went from being the second female lead to the leading lady and was permitted to do slightly more than stand around looking virtuous and imperiled.
Somebody would find a vaccine.
It's all we're working on at the lab, Virg. Maybe you better not send her to school today.
All right. You think you should go to work?
I have to.
Oh, Bob. I'm so frightened.
Everything's gonna be all right, sweetheart.
This location is the Palazzo degli Uffici, which was the first building built in the late 30s with the plan of making Rome the location for the 1942 World's Fair. It was meant to be the headquarters for the whole exhibition. Here it stands for the Mercer Institute of Chemical Research. And there's Dr. Mercer himself. Yes, he looks familiar, and yes, you've seen him before. Umberto Rajo, sometimes billed as Umi Rajo or Bert Rajo, was a very prolific Italian character actor whose career spanned about 50 years, from Italian films made in the immediate post-war era right up to Choi Hawk's Double Team in 1997, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dennis Rodman. The true definition of a trooper, and he only passed away in 2016 at the ripe old age of 93. Perhaps best remembered for playing a red herring, and what a red herring, in Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Both Rajo and Giacomo Rossi Stewart can be seen together in Emilio Miraglia's The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave. Rajo and Price had worked together in The Villainous Concert in Queen of the Nile 2 years previously. These white lab coats don't look quite practical, do they? They look more like haute couture. The conversation that follows, again, is often used as an example by people who don't like The Last Man on Earth as one of the reasons why they think it fails to pass muster. Too talky, too static. We want vampires. And I might have felt that way originally, but today, after all we've been through with a global pandemic, this scene plays very differently, and it's one of my favorites in the movie now. Morgan and Cortland embody two sides of the essential argument we heard throughout the first year of the COVID-19 lockdown. Morgan is the I trust science guy, content to wait and see, content to put his talents to trial and error, to defer his fears and insecurities, and trust research and collaboration. Cortland is an alarmist, a conspiracy theorist, or at best a conspiracy theorist sympathizer. He's in free fall. He's willing to throw away his disciplines on a gut feeling. In a way, this is a schematic for the disagreement between Ben and Harry in Night of the Living Dead. Ben, a rationalist, wants to remain on ground level, fighting the good fight, open and available to new information. Harry, on the other hand, wants to go down into the cellar, to bury himself, to hide. It's worth noting, I guess, that both Ben and Harry die on their chosen battlegrounds, Harry in the cellar, cannibalized by his own daughter, and Ben on his feet on the first floor with a view of the perimeter. Here, too, both these men will end up dead, one undead for a while, but in the bigger picture, neither one will survive this. The protagonists of both The Last Man on Earth and Night of the Living Dead do nothing more in the grand scheme of things than simply buy themselves some time. The newscaster is portrayed by Ettore Ribota, billed as Hector Ribota, typical Italian utility player with dozens of film titles to his credit, but rarely does he have a proper name in a movie. Instead, he's police officer, bank manager, official, agent, TV reporter. And that's Antonio Correvi playing the governor. Blink and you'll miss him as a Roman senator in Ben-Hur, but he has slightly more to do as the family butler in the 1966 Barbara Steele vehicle, An Angel for Satan. There's something very Mad Men about The Last Man on Earth. Well, this is the time frame, isn't it? The husband and father who goes out into the world and brings home none of it that he's willing to share with his wife and child. He's a secret keeper, biding time. He knows best.
Nothing.
Mommy, where are you? Mommy, I can't see.
Having victims of the plague go blind seems to have been an invention of Bill Lester, who I feel improves on the deaths of both Kathy and Virginia. Sorry, spoiler warning. From both Richard Matheson's original novel and his screen adaptation for Hammer. We've already heard on the soundtrack Virginia screaming, "I can't see," which is kind of blood-curdling. We'll come back to that shortly. Christy Cortland is wonderfully pathetic as the dying Kathy, although I don't think that we can suppose that's her real voice.
Mommy, help me. Mommy.
It kills me that, as aggrieved as both parents are by their daughter's condition, neither of them interacts with her. Neither of them comforts her or even tells them they're there, which strikes me as profoundly weird. And you can call that bad direction, or you can call it a legacy of that sort of middle-class disinclination of adults to really connect with their children. And it plays for me as part of that aloofness that I spoke of earlier.
I've got to pick Ben Cortman up on the way to the lab. No one is to come into this house. Now remember that.
Much has been made of George Romero's debt to Richard Matheson and possibly The Last Man on Earth for Night of the Living Dead, but I don't think much has been made of the fact that there's a bit of the crazies in this story as well, certainly from the standpoint of the American military having to come into a residential neighborhood and bat cleanup in the face of a catastrophic event.
Please, for God's sake, don't take him away like this. You can't. You can't.
In both I Am Legend and the Matheson screenplay, there's a funny little in-joke about Ben Cortman's choice of musical doorbell, both choices which comment wryly on the situation. In the book, it's the old drunkard's lament, How Dry Am I? And in his screenplay for The Night Creatures, the jingle is Happy Days Are Here Again, an upbeat anthem of the Great Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1932 re-election campaign song. No music here, though. I'm guessing Robert Lippert wasn't about to pay royalties for a 10-second gag, and I can't say I blame him.
Who's there? It's me, Ben. We're late.
Giacomo Rossi Stewart was half Scottish on his mother's side and played lots of non-Italians, a Cossack in King Vidor's War and Peace, a Viking in Mario Bava's Knives of the Adventure, an American Deep Space Commander Rod Jackson in Antonio Margheriti's War Between the Planets and Snow Devils.
You laughed at me and my theory. You might be one of them.
Ben, look, you're ill. You ought to see a doctor.
No doctors. You take care of your life, I'll take care of mine. Now get away from here. You understand? Get away from here!
The winter of 1961 was a bitter one in Rome, and Vincent Price remembered having to change costume on location, literally on the street, between setups, and of palming his Italian driver a few extra lire to keep the motor and the heater running for costume changes in the back seat. If you were to look up the word Saturnine in the dictionary, Umi Raho's face would be the perfect illustration. He didn't light up the screen in the traditional sense with actory flourishes or bravado, but he was always good company and always value added for any European film production of a certain vintage. Riccardo Freda used Raho effectively in both the 1964 Gothic horror film Lo Spettro, The Ghost, as a local vicar who tries in vain to warn the principals away from lives devoted to debauchery and evil, and in Freda's Romeo y Giulietta from that same year, he plays Shakespeare's sage Friar Lawrence, in whose sad face we read the weight of the tragedy at the story's unhappy finish. Raho wasn't even 40 here. He was just a couple of years older than Giacomo Rossi Stewart, but he's already playing old men, and yet he would outlive just about every one of his co-stars in this movie, and it wasn't even close. Price and Rossi Stewart were both more than 20 years in their graves before Umberto Raho laid the hammer down in 2016. Score another point for Team Lester, as far as I'm concerned, vis-a-vis how the business of the death of Kathy Neville or Kathy Morgan is handled. In the book, it's handled a bit elliptically, a flashback within a flashback following Neville's reminiscence of the day Virginia died. We just get flashes of the guardsmen grabbing Kathy's wrapped body from Neville and putting it into the fiery pit, but as to how it all played out, we can only imagine. From Matheson, quote, "The great fire crackling, roaring yellow, sending its dense and grease-thick clouds into the sky, Kathy's tiny body in his arms, the man coming up and snatching her away as if he were taking a bundle of rags, the man lunging into the dark mist carrying his baby, him standing there while pile-driver blows of horror drove him down with their impact." End quote. Matheson elaborates in his screenplay, having Neville actually convince the soldiers coming to his house to collect his dead daughter's body to let him bring her to the pit himself. It's a stretch and a little bit of a contrivance, and then Ben Cortman drives Neville to the pit, at which point the guardsmen take the body away from him, even as he resists them and offer him a conciliatory swallow of whiskey from a hip flask. I prefer the way the grim business is handled here, with Morgan arriving home after the decision has been made. He's too late, and that's that. The view of Kathy's empty bed, it speaks volumes. This scene is appropriately infernal, and the shivery Sawtelle and Schefter accompaniment really seals the hellish atmosphere. All the soldiers in their olive drab, the same soldiers who fought so valiantly for humanity against giant insects and alien invaders in the 1950s, are now reduced to burning our loved ones like cordwood.
Get behind those lines. Look sharp there. Move. Move along. Make way for that truck. Make way. Hey, you, mister! Come back! Come back!
Morgan asking the Nomcom if this truck has come from Market Street has led some viewers to believe that The Last Man on Earth takes place in San Francisco, but there is no other evidence of that, and I think we can safely discount it. The setting isn't meant to be one place or another. It's a typical American city. That's the point. It's everywhere.
Hey, you don't belong in here. Get out. I said get out.
I want my daughter.
Mister, a lot of daughters are in there, including my own.
That's a powerful line, and it didn't come from Richard Matheson, so chalk up another one for Bill Lester. A really chilling delivery to whomever dubbed Emma Daniele, Chef's Kiss. It punctuates audibly something that was rendered with awful subtlety in Chapter 9 of I Am Legend. Matheson writes, quote, Virginia Neville's heart had stopped, end quote, and that's it. In his screenplay, Matheson has Neville waking up on the couch one morning with Virginia beside him, and upon attempting to awaken her, he realizes that she has died. He screams for her to wake up, but it's too late. I think The Last Man on Earth has the edge here. Decision, Lester. I understand why Matheson didn't care for Price as the hero of his story. I get it. And I get why Matheson didn't like the reduction of I Am Legend that is The Last Man on Earth. Matheson likened Robert Neville to Danielle Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, as I said earlier. He name-checks Defoe's immortal wash ashore on the page, and when Neville makes a pet of a stray dog, he names the animal Friday after Crusoe's eventual island companion. Robert Neville and Scott Carey, the protagonist of Matheson's The Shrinking Man and of the Universal International film adaptation The Incredible Shrinking Man, were both Crusoe-esque by conception. Normal, regular men who find themselves in impossible, unbelievable situations and learn and grow while fighting for survival. While suffering many of the tribulations of Robert Neville, Robert Morgan has a much shallower learning curve. He already knows the science. He's already elevated intellectually. He doesn't have to, as Robert Neville does, become another man, become a better man. There's no Robinson Crusoe in him. Sidebar, producer Alfred Zugsmith wanted actor Dan O'Herlihy to star in The Incredible Shrinking Man, but O'Herlihy passed because he had just played Robinson Crusoe and had been nominated for an Academy Award in The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe for Louis Buñuel. He didn't want to play another isolated character. Back to I Am Legend. Knowing Matheson didn't like Vincent Price as the protagonist of his story, it's funny to read in Matheson a reference to a drunken Robert Neville comparing himself to Clarence in Shakespeare's Richard III, drowning himself in his Malmsey as the Duke of Clarence was murdered by the Duke of Gloucester. In Universal's Tower of London in 1939, a non-verse take on Richard III, Vincent Price played Clarence, drowned in wine by Basil Rathbone's Crookback King, with an assist from Boris Karloff. And in Roger Corman's 1962 Tower of London remake, Price played Richard III, and the unfortunate Clarence was played by Charles Macaulay, later Count Dracula to William Marshall's Blackula. But I digress. This set piece ends in a ghastly payoff that has become something like a genre primal scene. Obviously, Stephen King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary comes to mind as a sort of brisk turnaround British writer W. W. Jacobs' classic 1902 short story The Monkey's Paw, the original Be Careful What You Wish For cautionary tale. In King's novel, dead ones buried in a particular spot in the Maine woods return to a semblance of life, with disastrous results for all and sundry. It's King's most taboo-shattering novel, and the one that affected him most deeply to the point of almost not letting it be published at all. By the novel's end, Lewis Creed, a man who has lost his young son and his wife, among others, and who has endured unimaginable horror because of it, sits despondently yet hopefully in his kitchen. The earth finally returns his beloved Rachel, who shambles into their home and drops a cold hand on Lewis's shoulder. Darling, it said, it, not she, through a mouthful of dirt. Full stop. In Mary Lambert's 1989 adaptation of Pet Sematary, we see the awful simulacrum that is the reanimated Rachel, her clothes besmirched with sod, one eye liquefied in its socket. And yet Lewis welcomes Rachel into his arms. The camera pans away, and we hear him scream. In the same year that Pet Sematary was published, Pupi Avate Zader posited that there are certain zones in the earth where, once buried, the dead can return. The film ends with the protagonist being reunited with his dead lover. She looks a bit better than Rachel Creed, or Virginia Neville for that matter, and yet as the reunited lovers embrace, the camera again pans away, and we hear the man scream. Coincidence? Maybe. But the man who shot the last man on Earth, Franco Della Colli, also shot Zader. Now we can ponder who was influenced by who, or who ripped off whom until the dead come home, or we can just be happy that this echo keeps reverberating through the horrorverse. From a survivalist standpoint, I Am Legend and The Last Man on Earth are both examples of what we call bug-in apocalyptic scenarios. Stories about people who shelter in place, who fortify and defend, who bug in. Bolt the doors, bar the windows, shoot anyone who tries to break in. Examples from this subgenre include Arch Obler's 5, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and more recently A Quiet Place, and It Comes at Night. Bug-out apocalyptic titles, in which characters taken on the arches after a cataclysmic event, include Panic in Year Zero, No Blade of Grass, Damnation Alley, 28 Days Later, and The Road. Both types of survival tales have their charms. Both present unique challenges inherent in surviving a cataclysmic situation, and both have a certain cozy factor to them. The bug-in movies allow us to imagine a situation where we can stay at home all the time, though I suppose the COVID lockdowns have put the kibosh on that fantasy, and the bug-out movies are sort of like extreme camping. At this point in his career, which began in the late 20s in theater, first as an actor and then as a director, Sidney Salkow was working mostly for television, episodes of the big TV shows of the day, Maverick, Wyatt Earp with Hugh O'Brien, Mike Hammer with Darren McGavin, the Western anthology series Death Valley Days. This was his first feature since 1959's The Big Night, a neat little socially conscious crime drama set in Venice, California, starring singer Randy Sparks as a punk kid who finds a valise full of stolen money, horror hotel star Venetia Stevenson as the good girl who loves him, Dick Ferran as his semi-drunk of a father, Jesse White as a corrupt cop. Nice location photography, the backdrop full of oil derricks. Salkow has been branded a utility director, banging out second features, all formula, no artistry, and I think that's unfair. I like most of the movies of his that I've seen, even when they've seemed a bit formulaic, but they always look good, and they clip along efficiently, particularly his westerns like Gun Duel in Durango with George Montgomery and Ann Robinson, and Gun Brothers with Neville Brand and Buster Crabbe. And his crime pictures, Chicago Confidential with Brian Keefe and Beverly Garland. Dick Foran is in that too. Las Vegas Shakedown with Dennis O'Keefe. I tend to like his contemporary pictures more than I do his westerns. His westerns, though they do have a particular charm, feel made to order and of their time, while stuff like The Big Night and Chicago Confidential feel threaded with a bit more relevance.
Don't run away. Come back here. Don't run away. Come back.
As Vincent Price chases this dog, we'll see a little bit more of the EUR. God, I feel so bad for Price having to hustle up that hill. I hope they did it in one take.
Every inch of this town, I've got to find it.
These steps belong to Rome's Palazzo della Civiltà Italiano, the Square Colosseum, which you can just barely see at the top of the frame. It was meant to be the Museum of Italian Civilization at the 1942 World's Fair. It's now the headquarters of the design house Fendi. The Square Colosseum figures prominently in Federico Fellini's section of the 1962 anthology film Boccaccio 70, in front of which a giant Anita Ekberg capers seductively. Il Fugo, the mushroom. Built as a water tower for hydrating the lush gardens of the EUR, it also houses a restaurant at the top. It doesn't revolve, though. Il Fugo turns up in Michelangelo Antonioni's L'Eclisse, made just before this movie. And you can kind of understand why they included it here, for that LA feel, I guess. It reminds one of the space-age theme building at the Los Angeles International Airport, which was being completed while The Last Man on Earth was in production. Post The Last Man on Earth, Sidney Salkow would work again with Vincent Price in his 1963 horror anthology film Twice Told Tales, based on the writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne, made after Last Man but released earlier. His last film, released in 1965, was The Murder Game, shot in England for Robert Lippard, Harry Spalding scripting, and featuring some very fine British talent, including Gerald Sim and Hammer horror stalwart Duncan Lamont, plus Diane Cannon a few years before her breakout role in Paul Mazursky's Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. Of Ubaldo Ragona, who shares a directing credit with Sidney Salkow, I know very little, I'm afraid. Born in Sicily in 1960, he died in Rome in 1987 at the age of 70. A former cineast who turned his hand to making documentaries. And Last Man does have a verite feel to it, doesn't it? A crumbly neorealismo. In scenes of Price crawling around the dead city, or when cooped up in his shabby digs. I always understood it about The Last Man on Earth that Sidney Salkow worked specifically with Vincent Price, and Ubaldo Ragona led the Italian crew, cinematographer, editors, production designer Giorgio Giovannini, who also worked on the art department of several Fellini films, La Dolce Vita, Roma, Satyricon, Amarcord, Casanova, and was a set designer for Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires. Salkow got sole directing credit in the American version. Did Ragona get sole credit when L'ultimo uomo della terra played in Italian cinemas? Yes. Actually, the Italian posters are gorgeous. The business with the dog is a huge portion of I Am Legend. Neville brings to his acquiring of a pet the same diligence and resourcefulness, the same obsessive compulsiveness upon which he has relied to survive the vampire apocalypse, and it's a very engaging, engrossing, heartrending segment of the book, which gets very short shrift here in The Last Man on Earth. They even chose a poodle to play the dog, like they don't want us to be too emotionally invested. Matheson expanded on the dog's subplot significantly in his screenplay for Hammer and devised an even ghastlier demise for it than he had in the novel. From a December 4th, 1957 letter to Tony Hines from Jeffrey M. Sherlock of the Motion Picture Association of America, Sherlock being the successor to Joseph Breen as the arbiter of the production code, who identified various problematic points throughout the screenplay that he deemed advisable to eliminate. Page 77, gruesomeness as the dog is attacked. Violence against the dog was a big no-no in American films, maybe even more so than in British films. Dogs were part of the American dream. They were in the family portrait. The MPAA wasn't saying, don't kill the dog. They just didn't want it protracted and disturbing, which is how it was meant to be. In the novel, the dog occupies about 17 pages. Here, the entire episode takes up 5-6 minutes of screen time. In I Am Legend, Will Smith gets a proper best friend in that screenplay by Akiva Goldsman and Mark Protasevich. The dog already has been a family pet to the Nevilles, a puppy when the world went south, and it grows to adult size to help Neville hunt the, whatever they called them in that movie, the Dark Seekers. Sounds like a Melbourne folk combo. There is no dog in the Omega Man, but Charlton Heston gets a black teenager, Eric Launeville, as a pet. It's that weird Hollywood custom where in place of a dog as scripted, the filmmakers instead use a black character, as they did with LeVar Burton in Steve McQueen's last movie, The Hunter. That's what passed for inclusion back in the day. Burying the dog had not been the agony he had supposed it would be. In a way, it was almost like burying threadbare hopes and false excitements. From that day on, he learned to accept the dungeon he existed in, neither seeking to escape with sudden daring do, nor beating his pate bloody on its walls. And thus resigned, he returned to work. Anyway, that's how it goes in the novel, where the death of the dog and the introduction of the character Ruth occur 2 calendar years apart.
What's the use?
Here, as in Matheson's screenplay for The Night Creatures, Neville is in the act of burying the dog when he sees the last woman on Earth, seemingly from a distance. Long shot. Woman. We cannot tell what she looks like, she is so far away. All we can see is that she wears a white dress and is walking across the long grassed field ahead of us. Close shot. Neville. He looks thunderstruck. The shovel falls from his hands. Actually, here, Morgan doesn't drop the shovel, he gives it a phallic thrust into the earth. Well, that's Italy for you. Vincent Price doesn't look too comfortable running, does he? Well, anyway, introducing Franca Patoia as Ruth. She has a really great wild woman look. We get a more practical outfit than the white dress that Richard Matheson had wanted, but otherwise Franca Patoia strikes me as perfect casting for the character. She sort of reminds me a little bit, and I mean a little bit, of Sophia Loren in Vittorio De Sica's Two Women, that ragged, end-of-the-war look of a traumatized survivor who has been wearing the same clothes for 2 years running, literally running. Born right here in Rome in 1936, Franca Patoia was, I think, just 24 when she made The Last Man on Earth, about 30 years younger than her leading man. But she reads a little bit older, doesn't she? She has experience in her face and a kind of useful, tough beauty, quite unlike her opposite in the film, Emma Danieli. Patoia had about a 10-year acting career in Italy, after which she continued to appear in films sporadically, often with several years in between assignments. She was married later to Italian actor Ugo Tognazzi, probably best remembered internationally for La Cage aux Folles, and appeared with him in his 1967 absurdist comedy Il Fischio al Naso, Un Film Differente, opposite Tognazzi and American actress Tina Louise. She played his girlfriend in that, and the two were married in 1972. Beyond that, like Emma Danieli, she did a lot of costumers, including 2 Sandokan adventure films with vacationing American stars Ray Danton and Guy Madison, and Duel of the Champions, a sword and sandal programmer starring Alan Ladd. She had made an earlier film with Ricardo Montalban, the Italian-Spanish co-production Desert Warrior, whose location shooting in Cairo was interrupted by the Suez Canal crisis summer of 1956. It took 3 years for The Last Man on Earth to make it stateside, where, as I said earlier, it was put into rotation with zero fanfare on double and triple bill playdates with the Italian Goliath and the Vampires, the Japanese King Kong vs. Godzilla, and such British imports as Unearthly Stranger, directed by John Krish, known predominantly as a maker of documentaries and starring John Neville and Jean Marsh, and Sidney Hayer's Circus of Horrors with Anton Diffring and Donald Pleasance. The following year, it could be seen playing in support of another Vincent Price vehicle, War Gods of the Deep, a.k.a. City in the City, as well as the Jerry Lewis comedy The Disorderly Orderly, and the Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello teen flick Bikini Beach. As an aside, it's worth noting that when ads for The Last Man on Earth were appearing in the entertainment section of your local newspaper, Price was also highly visible as a spokesman for Sears Roebuck as their designated international art buyer and pitch man for a line of original works acquired both domestically and abroad that were made available to the public exclusively by Sears. I believe ordinary Americans are more culturally minded than most people give them credit for, including the Americans themselves, Price said in an interview syndicated in January 1964. One of Price's partners in the Sears venture was Sidney Salkow's brother Lester, who was Price's agent. Sidney Salkow's other brother Irving was also a successful Hollywood agent. When The Last Man on Earth was reviewed by the Los Angeles Times critic John L. Scott on May 9, 1964, the assessment was vaguely encouraging. Price's portrayal, quote, almost becomes a one-man show, and the versatile actor makes the most of it, end quote. But what's interesting about the review is that John Scott refers to the creatures assailing Robert Morgan not as vampires, but as zombies. Mind you, this was before zombies were depicted in films as massing against human characters to rend them limb from limb. In some of the old voodoo movies, like the Halperin Brothers' White Zombie and its follow-up Revolt of the Zombies, and wartime cheapies like Gene Yarborough's King of the Zombies and Steve Seekely's Revenge of the Zombies, the living dead can and will crush up on sundry victims, but it's never in a hungry, tearing way, as would be the case post-Night of the Living Dead. Zombie pods or hordes in those movies were more like angry human mobs. In White Zombie, they just throw people off a cliff. Their being the Walking Dead has almost nothing to do with the fates of their victims. They might just as easily have been the Teamsters beating up Marlon Brando and on the waterfront. The closest thing we got in those days to crowds of creatures massing on a victim to eat them were in Looney Tunes cartoons when, say, Sylvester the Cat would chase Tweety into the wrong backyard and suddenly find himself surrounded by dogs who then close in on him, blocking him from our view, the implication being that he's being eaten alive. But anyway, for the critic to make this jump from vampires to zombies is really intriguing vis-a-vis Night of the Living Dead's arguable debt to The Last Man on Earth. Interesting, too, is that Harry Spalding, who passed the Matheson novel on to Robert Lippert, later wrote The Earth Dies Screaming, directed by Terence Fisher on a timeout from Hammer, in which it's aliens or alien robots who are running rampant around the countryside, but robots who kill their victims and reanimate their corpses, not for flesh eating, mind you, but to do their bidding. The zombies in that movie have white eyes, like the zombies, or whatever they are, in Eugenio Martino's Horror Express from 1972. But, again, I digress. Other reviews for The Last Man on Earth in the industry trades were not so enthusiastic. Depressing cautionary tale falls a long way short of entertainment. Mediocre spine chiller, cropped one critic, while another remarked, grim, only occasionally effective. I first became aware of The Last Man on Earth from books on horror and science fiction films that were published in the late 60s and early 70s, though often I find when I go back and peruse those books, Dennis Gifford's The Pictorial History of Horror Movies, David Peary's The Vampire Cinema, John Brosnan's Future Tense, Barry Patterson's The Seal of Dracula, there's actually very little critical commentary on the film in them, just synopses and pictures, that one classic shot of Price recoiling as a vampire thrusts its pallid arm through the partially open front door. I'm thinking maybe the authors of those early books never actually saw The Last Man on Earth and simply repeated Richard Matheson's oft-quoted complaints about the film in lieu of having their own opinions. And, you know, that's understandable, as movies were not so readily available back then as they are now. I don't envy the work of those pioneering authors, Gifford, Carlos Clarence, Ivan Butler, Calvin Thomas Beck, though I do admire the genre overviews they published. For movie lovers and monster kids of a certain vintage, those books were the gateway. Pre-internet, pre-social media, we had to find out about these movies by reading, and the eternal flame of hope, one of these movies would pop up from time to time on TV. It was the pictures from this movie that sold me, that whetted my appetite, that made The Last Man on Earth a must-see. I was intrigued and wanted to see the movie, but I wouldn't probably for another 20 years. And I saw The Omega Man years before I ever got to see this. While I waited for my first exposure to the film, I had to contend with dueling critics and their polarized view of it. In the Phil Hardy Aurum Science Fiction Encyclopedia, Last Man was trounced for its, quote, crude repetitive violence, end quote, and Price's, quote, oddly low-key performance, end quote, which just strikes me as a weird and off-the-mark commentary. My friend Michael Weldon was closer to the mark in the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film when he declared The Last Man on Earth, quote, an end-of-the-world vampire zombie thriller with an undeserved bad rap. No blood and guts, but a terrifying look at the last of a dead race, end quote. I mentioned Calvin Beck a second ago. In his 1975 book, Heroes of the Horrors, potted biographies of Lon Chaney, Sr. and Jr., Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Peter Lorre, and Vincent Price, he does go to bat for The Last Man on Earth, and I quote, "Even on what was obviously a low-budget, director Sidney Salkow created strong impressions of death and putrescent horror permeating a world in which all normal life has ceased and been replaced by wandering hordes of vampire-like ghouls who have been transformed to this state by a mysterious modern plague." I confess I may have been underwhelmed by my first pass at the film. I don't really remember how or when I came to see it for the first time, but it wasn't any earlier than the 90s. I did buy it as a gray market bootleg VHS tape, the movie having long fallen into the public domain, and after the turn of the century, or the new millennium, I gladly upgraded to DVD. I'm really excited now to have it on Blu-ray. It helps, I think, that age has dulled the sharper points of my disappointment in genre movies. I'm no longer an idealist. I have a better understanding of why certain movies were made the way they were, and I know now that The Last Man on Earth wasn't an attempt by all involved to make the best adaptation of I Am Legend possible. Those guys simply saw in that book the potential to make a little picture, to turn a little profit, and that's what they did. No 90-minute or 2-hour film is ever going to do justice to I Am Legend. That's just not going to happen. So much of the appeal of that novel is the bigness of its logline to one side, the smallness of Robert Neville's life, his routine, his schedule, his observations and frustrations, and his little rewards to himself for life's tremendous pains, whether that reward is a pretty mural on the wall to look at, a dish of sherbet for dessert, or a whole bottle of rye and a slow descent to the carpet. It's the finer details that make that novel a perennial reread for me, but no one is ever going to give the time of day to that stuff. That's why we read books. Movies are a different thing. They are a reduction of the written word, an evocation of it, and have their own diversions and delights that prose can never replace. All this to say, I've reached a place where I am delighted by The Last Man on Earth, and I hope for those of you that are listening that you either already are or that you can get there too.
You can't join us. You're a monster to them.
Franca Batoya looks great here, and by great I mean ghastly. I'm guessing they pulled the old Mario Bava trick of making her up with red highlights that were then masked by a red spotlight, which, when dialed down, made the shadows appear on her face, giving her a deathly hue.
Many of the people you destroyed were still alive.
It's a shame that the actress never did any more work in the horror genre, because she has a wonderful quality that is more than merely ornamental. She would have been great in the gialli of the early 1970s, but she wasn't working much by then. Her only film role of the 70s was Marco Ferreri's 1974 farce Don't Touch the White Woman, an absurdist angle on Custer's last stand, filmed in Paris alongside Marcello Mastroianni, Catherine Deneuve, Philippe Noiret, and her husband Ugo Tognazzi. And she made only one more film after that, Claudio Fragasso's 1993 skinhead drama Teste Rasate, playing the on-screen mother of her real-life son, Gianmarco Tognazzi, in a downbeat tale of a rootless Roman youth who is drawn into a neo-fascist cell. I am happy to report that as of this recording, she is still alive and presumably well in her mid-80s, and likely the last surviving member of this production. I spoke earlier of the de-emphasis of Robert Morgan's sexuality in The Last Man on Earth, presented as it is in stark contrast to Robert Neville's in I Am Legend, in which he is tormented by the lack of intimacy, by the lack of release. In the book, Neville shares a tender romantic moment with Ruth. It isn't sexual intercourse, but, well, to quote Matheson, their mouths held together for a long time and her arms gripped with desperate tightness around his neck. He felt the shuddering rise and fall of her breasts as she held close to him, her arms tight around his body, her face against his neck. His big hands moved roughly through her hair, stroking and feeling the silky strands. So we're talking first base here, but, not bad, all things considered. Then Neville has to go ruin things by suggesting that he test Ruth's blood, and it becomes a very bad first date. She clubs him with a mallet and absconds. He doesn't see her again for 6 months. In Matheson's screenplay for The Night Creatures, a sex scene between Neville and Ruth occurs in an ellipse between scenes. After we see the two kissing passionately, we cut to Neville's bedroom, where Ruth slumbers alone, but in a slip. cinematic code for sex having been had. In The Omega Man, Charlton Heston and Last Lady Rosalind Cash have sex, no ifs, ands, or buts. Something of a big deal in 1971, as the love scene was interracial. Not really a big deal for the movies at the time, but for Charlton Heston and for Roz Cash, who later commented, "Hey, I got to screw Moses." In between, we have The Last Man on Earth. Price plays the tenderness Morgan feels for Ruth, but that's as far as it goes. And for a reason. From the letter from Jeffrey Sherlock dated December 4th, 1957, quote, page 100, "Within the framework of this type of story, we could not approve the indication of an illicit relationship between Neville and Ruth. Such an indication is quite clear on this page and should be avoided." End quote. I'm not quite sure why the suggestion of lovemaking between these two characters would be considered illicit. I mean, literally forbidden by law, because they're both widowed and the world is clearly ended, but that was the MPAA at the time. Not that any of us would have expected Vincent Price to come on like Robert Mitchum or anything with his shirt unbuttoned to the navel. That's not how he loved. He was always better at grieving in an abstracted, Gothic sort of way. If we look to, say, The Tomb of Ligeia and The Abominable Dr. Phibes as examples, and as such, he is on brand here, if somewhat more quotidianly. And to be honest, at this point in my life, I find the tenderness here, the chasteness of the union between these two characters to be surpassingly poignant and truer to life. And I love how the wreath of garlic becomes the symbol of the kind of love that these two have forged with one another. In the 2007 adaptation of I Am Legend, the film completely obliterates the last third of the novel. Neville meets a girl, but the relationship is strictly platonic. There's even a cute kid thrown into the mix. There's no sexual dynamic, and there's also no psychological conflict. No one is out, as in the novel Matheson's adaptation and The Last Man on Earth, to get Neville or Morgan. There are no living vampires, no infected ones to tell him he's done something terrible, that the life he's been living for the past 3 years has been their horror. There's no philosophical or ethical schism as presented by Matheson. There's no whipsaw reversal of perspective for Neville. And when he dies at the end, it's his play and completely on his own terms. Great for the character, I guess. But it really undermines the whole social subtext and the tragedy of I Am Legend as written. It makes of I Am Legend nothing more than a rousing sci-fi adventure. I'm not saying the 2007 remake isn't enjoyable, but I do miss that essential conflict.
Robert,
Yes, Ruth,
what if this doesn't last?
but it will. I've already checked it under the microscope. Wait, I'll show you. I'll prove it to you. I'll check it again.
We're in the bell lap of The Last Man on Earth here, an ending that runs fairly parallel with the novel, foreshortening only the passage of time that falls between this business in the book and Ruth's return to Neville's life 6 months later, and Matheson's screenplay, with one significant difference. In The Night Creatures, in which it's worth noting Neville has the added value of an electrified fence around his property, Ben Cortman is able to breach Neville's security and gain access to his house. Cortman actually enters Neville's bedroom and locks the door against the other vampires, wanting Neville for himself, evincing an intelligence that the character lacks here. He advances on Neville, but his play is interrupted by the arrival of the New Order. The big difference between the novel, in which Neville is injured, captured, and brought back to New Order HQ for summary execution, spared ultimately by Ruth, who slips him poison so he can take himself out, and Matheson's screenplay for Hammer, is that Neville is spared ultimately in The Night Creatures. They don't kill him. Don't even want him dead. Neville lives. Cortman and the other vampires are slaughtered by the New Order, leaving Neville to wait his turn, which never comes. Ruth explains, "You're too valuable to kill. Your immunity to the germ is worth more to us than that." Which could actually be creepier. We don't quite know what the New Order's plan for Neville is. Is he going to live among them? His killing of their number is forgiven with an eye toward the greater good? Or is he doomed to be a sort of a lab rat enslaved by his own immunity, a blood cow for a brave new world? Those questions are left unanswered as Ruth leads an enfeebled Neville away and he protests, "I can't leave my house." As Morgan watches Ben Cortman go down in a Warner Brothers-style hail of bullets, it's worth noting, somewhat sadly, that the two died but a year apart, less 5 days, with Price passing away on October 25th, 1993 at the age of 82, and Giacomo Rossi Stewart on October 20th, 1994 at the age of 69.
You don't understand! Wait!
Get him! Get him!
Did Vincent Price ever have to do more running in any other movie than this one? I don't know which one he is, but Sidney Salkow's stunt Steve is one of the black shirts chasing Morgan in this last set piece. Steve told me that the scenes of Neville's home were filmed in the American Village, which was near the Overseas School of Rome. Presumably, this was a place where the families of non-Italian students who studied at the school could live in relatively close proximity. And I'm wondering if this bit was too. This seems an obvious location change here. I love that Morgan goes out swinging in The Last Man on Earth. I love the character of Robert Neville so much. He meant so much to me at an early age that I hate the thought of him having to kill himself to escape execution, as conceived by Richard Matheson. That's not a criticism of Matheson either. It's just that I love this variation in a movie that takes more than a few liberties with the source novel, while remaining, by consensus, the most faithful to it. I don't remember Vincent Price ever being this aerobic in a movie where he isn't the villain. I mean, look at him scaling a ledge like he's T.H.E. Cat, and he's doing it all in dad clothes. Morgan's use of, I presume they're tear gas canisters, and the rooftop and stairwell settings, all the guys in military-style dark uniforms, reminds me of the bravura opening set piece of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead follow-up, Dawn of the Dead, the opening scene set in the tenement. This location really is a church. It's La Chiesa di San Pio X, or the Church of St. Pius X, named for Pope Pius X, who died in 1914 and was canonized in 1954. The inherent paradox here is that Pope Pius resisted modernist interpretations of church doctrine, and yet this church, dedicated to his memory, is designed in a modernist style. The church may not even have been open for business at the time of shooting in February 1961. It would not be consecrated until April 30th of that year, which could be why the Last Man on Earth crew were able to get away with filming a shoot-'em-up here. Although Steve Salkow did tell me that the filmmakers who shot at night to avoid upsetting churchgoers did wind up in a little bit of hot water for their guerrilla-style tactics on holy ground. No specifics, unfortunately. Although I'm not in sympathy with their cause, I do love that every member of the New Order looks like they've just come from a beatnik poetry slam at the Hungry Eye. As we wrap here, I wonder about the influence Richard Matheson's script for The Night Creatures had on Hammer Film Productions, even though they had to pass on the project. Did the script kick around Wardour Street, where other writers for the company might have read it? The reason I ask is that there are elements of the script that have echoes in other Hammer films. For instance, in The Night Creatures, Robert Neville tape records his thoughts on vampires. In Horror of Dracula, written by Jimmy Sangster, Peter Cushing's Professor Van Helsing uses an early form of dictaphone for the same purpose. Now, I know the novel makes use of a dictaphone too, which belongs to Dr. Seward, and if that were all there was to it, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about this. But in The Night Creatures, Neville is bitten on the hand by a female vampire while he is examining her, and he scourges the wound with alcohol. In Hammer's Kiss of the Vampire, written by Tony Hines, Clifford Evans' Professor Zimmer is bitten on the wrist by a female vampire, and he scourges the wound with alcohol before cauterizing it with fire. Peter Cushing's Van Helsing does something similar in Horror of Dracula's first sequel, Brides of Dracula, credited to Peter Bryan and Edward Percy, but with uncredited additions by Jimmy Sangster and Tony Hines, cauterizing a vampire bite with a hot iron and then healing the wound with holy water. And while I'm thinking about it, could the alcoholism of Professor Zimmer in Kiss of the Vampire be a legacy of the binge drinking of Robert Neville? I mean, how many functional alcoholic vampire slayers are there in horrordom? In The Night Creatures, Neville asks no one in particular of the vampire horde, why don't they leave me alone? In Hammer's The Evil of Frankenstein, written by Tony Hines, Peter Cushing's Baron von Frankenstein, surveying the damage to his castle and laboratory by a local mob, asks, why can't they leave me alone? Now, I'm not alleging that any of these plot points or lines of dialogue were cadged from the Night Creatures script. I'm just wondering, could they have been? No writer worth his salt likes to see a good gag go to waste. So as we drop curtain on The Last Man on Earth, I will simply leave you with these questions. Make of them what you will. Thanks to a few good men who helped me, whether they knew it or not, in the assembly of this audio commentary. Steve Salkow, of course, and the mighty, mighty Tom Weaver, Richard Clemenson, Peter Fuller, David Schechter. Thank you, Richard Matheson. Thank you, Vincent Price. This is Richard Harland Smith. As ever, thank you for listening.